This morning, we're jumping back into that section just after the giving of the Ten Commandments. If the Ten Commandments are kind of familiar-ish, it'd be fair to say that these chapters that come afterwards probably a little less familiar. If you're in year 6 and you're dropping in to this series, then welcome. Let me offer 5 pointers to help us as we read what I think is quite tricky verses in places. Here's 5 pointers. First, and David was helpfully pointing these things out to us last week. If the Ten Commandments are the principles, then what we have here in the chapters that follow are kind of like the application. It's a bit like case law, saying, okay, here's the principle. Let me give you some examples of when this kind of thing happens to tease down the detail. One thing to say, don't kill. What about self-defense? What about manslaughter? Second, the purpose of this law was that ancient Israel might be a distinctive and holy people for God. God wanted for himself a people that would reflect his character in the world. And these laws were designed to help them to do exactly that. Third, because these laws were given for ancient Israel, they are not directly relevant to us. They're not. We don't need to obey them in the way that they are given. Doesn't mean they haven't got things to say to us, because they're helping us to see some of the principles, some of the things about the character and nature of God, but we don't directly obey them. Like lots of laws, they belong to the era in which they were given. It is technically still illegal in this country to be intoxicated in charge of a cow. In the Metropolitan District of London, it is illegal to shake or beat your carpet. Different provision for your doormat. You can beat that, but only before 8 a.m. Didn't know that, did you? Now, you can see that probably there was a time when that law was quite useful. But in an age of fitted carpets and vacuum cleaners, it's sort of kind of less relevant, even though you can probably see the principle that lay behind it. And it's kind of the same thing that we have here. These laws speak to a particular culture at a particular time. Fourth, a basic pattern persists, which is that we are saved by grace as God's people. Not by law, not by obeying law. We're saved by grace, but then law is given to teach us how to live to please God as his saved people. And then finally, instead of imagining that Jesus appears to just sort of sweep all of these laws to one side and ignore them, as we'll see in the second reading that we're going to have, in all sorts of ways, it's more accurate to say that what Jesus does is extend them and deepen them. So we've got 2 readings. We're going to read the passage from Exodus, then we're going to read a comment from Jesus about one of the phrases in our passage in Matthew 5. Let me pray before Ed comes to read. Father God, as we come to parts of the Bible that maybe we're slightly less familiar with, we know that in all sorts of ways sometimes they are excellent for us because they make us puzzle just that little bit more. And then we find things that we hadn't seen, that we hadn't understood about you, and about the way that we should live as a result. Would that be the case now? Help us as we listen and think together. Amen.
The first reading is taken from Exodus chapter 21, verse 12, to chapter 22, verse 15, which you can find on page 79 of the Church Bibles. Anyone who strikes a person with a fatal blow is to be put to death. However, if it is not done intentionally, but God lets it happen, they are to flee to a place I will designate. But if anyone schemes and kills someone deliberately, that person is to be taken from my altar and put to death. Anyone who attacks their father or mother is to be put to death. Anyone who attacks their father or mother is to be put to death. Anyone who attacks their father or mother is to be put to death. Anyone who attacks their father or mother is to be put to death. Anyone who attacks their father or mother is to be put to death. Anyone who attacks their father or mother is to be put to death. Anyone who attacks their father or mother is to be put to death. Anyone who attacks their father or mother is to be put to death. Anyone who attacks their father or mother is to be put to death. Anyone who attacks their father or mother is to be put to death. Anyone who attacks their father or mother is to be put to death. Anyone who attacks their father or mother is to be put to death. Anyone who attacks their father or mother is to be put to death. Anyone who attacks their father or mother is to be put to death. Anyone who attacks their father or mother is to be p Anyone who kidnaps someone is to be put to death, whether the victim has been sold or is still in the kidnapper's possession. Anyone who curses their father or mother is to be put to death. If people quarrel and one person hits another with a stone or with their fist, and the victim does not die but is confined to bed, the one who struck the blow will not be held liable if the other can get up and walk around outside with a staff. However, the guilty party must pay the injured person for any loss of time and see that the victim is completely healed. Anyone who beats their male or female slave with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a direct result. But they are not to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or two, since the slave is their property. If people are fighting and hit a pregnant woman, and she gives birth prematurely, but there is no serious injury, the offender must be fined whatever the woman's husband demands and the court allows. But if there is serious injury, you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. An owner who hits a male or female slave in the eye and destroys it must let the slave go free to compensate for the eye. And an owner who knocks out the tooth of a male or female slave must let the slave go free to compensate for the tooth. If a bull gores a man or woman to death, the bull is to be stoned to death, and its meat must not be eaten. But the owner of the bull will not be held responsible. If, however, the bull has had the habit of goring, and the owner has been warned but has not kept it penned up, and it kills a man or woman, the bull is to be stoned, and its owner also is to be put to death. However, if payment is demanded, the owner may redeem his life by the payment of whatever is demanded. This law also applies if the bull gores a son or a daughter. If the bull gores a male or female slave, the owner must pay 30 shekels of silver to the master of the slave, and the bull is to be stoned to death. If anyone uncovers a pit or digs one and fails to cover it, and an ox or a donkey falls into it, the one who opened the pit must pay the owner for the loss and take the dead animal in exchange. If anyone's bull injures someone else's bull and it dies, the two parties are to sell the live one and divide both the money and the dead animal equally. However, if it was known that the bull had the habit of goring, yet the owner did not keep it penned up, the owner must pay animal for animal and take the dead animal in exchange. Whoever steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it must pay back 5 head of cattle for the ox and 4 sheep for the sheep. If a thief is caught breaking in at night and is struck a fatal blow, the defender is not guilty of bloodshed. But if it happens after sunrise, the defender is guilty of bloodshed. Anyone who steals must certainly make restitution, but if they have nothing, they must be sold to pay for the theft. If the stolen animal is found alive in their possession, whether ox or donkey or sheep, they must pay back double. If anyone grazes their livestock in a field or vineyard and lets them stray, and they graze in someone else's field, the offender must make restitution from the best of his own field or vineyard. If a fire breaks out and spreads into thorn bushes, so that it burns sheaves of corn or standing corn or the whole field, the one who started the fire must make restitution. If anyone gives a neighbor silver or goods for safekeeping, and they are stolen from the neighbor's house, the thief, if caught, must pay back double. But if the thief is not found, the owner of the house must appear before the judges, and they must determine whether the owner of the house has laid hands on the other person's property. In all cases of illegal possession of an ox, a donkey, a sheep, a garment, or any other lost property about which someone says, "This is mine," both parties are to bring their cases before the judges. The one whom the judges declare guilty must pay back double to the other. If anyone gives a donkey, an ox, a sheep, or any other animal to their neighbor for safekeeping, and it dies or is injured or is taken away while no one is looking, the issue between them will be settled by the taking of an oath before the Lord that the neighbor did not lay hands on the other person's property. The owner is to accept this and no restitution is required. But if the animal was stolen from the neighbor, restitution must be made to the owner. If it was torn to pieces by a wild animal, the neighbor shall bring in the remains as evidence and shall not be required to pay for the torn animal. If anyone borrows an animal from their neighbor and it is injured or dies while the owner is not present, they must make restitution. But if the owner is with the animal, the borrower will not have to pay. If the animal was hired, the money paid for the hire covers the loss. And the second reading is taken from Matthew 5, verse 38 to 42, which you can find on page 970 of the Church Bibles. You have heard that it was said, "Eye for eye and tooth for tooth." But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. This is the word.
Thank you very much, Ed, for reading through. We're going to start by spending lots of time in Exodus 21 and 22. Lots of detail there. Much of it puzzling, confusing, surprising. And it won't surprise you to know that we're not going to look at every verse. But I hope we can draw out some themes. Okay, here's the first. The sanctity of human life. Or to put it another way, human life is precious in the sight of God, and it must be precious in our eyes too. How precious? Well, in this context, precious enough that if you take a human life, you forfeit your own. It's the first verse that we read, or that Ed read for us. Anyone who strikes a person with a fatal blow is to be put to death. Okay, but what happens if it was an accident? Well, verse 13. However, if it was not done intentionally, but God lets it happen, in the sense that he's over everything, they are to flee to a place I will designate. There's a system, in other words, for manslaughter, for an accidental death, and that develops into the principle of cities for refuge, where you can go and take refuge and argue your case. But of course, you need to be sure the person's telling the truth. So, verse 14, if anyone schemes and kills someone deliberately, but pretends otherwise, well, that person is to be taken from my altar and put to death. There's no protection for a person who falsely claims it was manslaughter when it wasn't. Okay? What about self-defense? What if you find someone breaking into your house and you kill them? Well, we got provision for that as well. Flip over the page to chapter 22. You see it there at the top of the page. If a thief is caught breaking in at night and is struck a fatal blow, the defender is not guilty of bloodshed. But if it happens after sunrise, the defender is guilty of bloodshed. So when it's dark and you can't see who it is, and you don't know whether they've got a knife or whether they are planning to kill you, then you defend yourself with lethal force, and that is justified. If you can see them and it's daytime, then you have no right to use lethal force in that circumstance. Striking, isn't it? Protecting your property doesn't justify taking a person's life, because people matter more than property, even people who are burglars. The importance of people over property becomes clear in other rules as well, doesn't it? You pick that up. One bull kills another bull, verse 35, and all that's needed is you sell the surviving bull and divide the money between you. But if a bull kills a person, that's there in verse 28, that's a different matter altogether. Then you put the bull to death and you don't even eat its meat. And if the farmer knew the bull was into this goring people business, then in that case, verse 29 applies. If, however, the bull has had the habit of goring, and the owner had been warned but has not kept it penned up, and it kills a man or a woman, the bull is to be stoned to death, and its owner also is to be put to death. It's that serious. Being responsible for causing somebody else's life to be ended. Human life really matters. You can't miss that from this range of laws. Notice also that there are specific rules about the way that parents are treated. So, with anyone else, you have to kill a person to get yourself the death penalty. But with your parents, do you see that, verse 15? With your parents, just attacking them will do. Actually, verse 17, simply cursing them is enough to earn yourself the death penalty. It's really strong. Parents, be encouraged. Children, be warned. No, seriously. I think what's being played out here is the fact that parents give life, but they are life givers in imitation of God, who is the ultimate life giver. And so in that sense, that this sort of dismissal or rejection or cursing of your parents somehow reflects an attitude towards the giver of life himself. I think that's why we get this special provision. And it really says to us that families really matter, don't they? And you put some of this together straight away and you begin to think, well, does my life reflect this principle that people matter more than property and that families matter particularly? How will it be over the summer for you? What will you give priority to? How will your time be used? Am I the only man who will find himself busying himself away with DIY tasks when other people are sitting around chatting and having conversations? And somehow I'll be demonstrating the way that things seem to be mattering more to me than people do in those kind of moments. And I need to have a bit of a rethink. It's very easy, isn't it, to find ways in which we begin to care more about stuff than we do about people. More about the black oblong that we hold in our hands so much of our days, which isn't a person, but a little bit of electronic hardware. And we think it's connecting us with people, but actually all the time it's not. So people matter more than property. Okay, so first, the sanctity of human life. Then second, the particular care and provision that is granted to the vulnerable. I imagine that as Ed read through these verses, the verses that kind of puzzled us and perhaps landed most uncomfortably with us were those that related to slavery. And again, because the Bible mentions something doesn't mean that it approves of it. Slavery existed, and now here are laws that try and control the way in which slavery happens. And it's worth also underlining David's comments from last week that when we read of slavery here, it's not the sort of the transatlantic slave trade that we should be thinking of. There's an elderly member of the congregation, now housebound, so isn't here with us on a Sunday, but she frequently talks about her time as a young girl when she was in service. Now, what does she mean by that? She means that she was a servant in a stately home for a long period of her life. Think Downton Abbey. It's that sort of a feel to it. And what she is remembering is closer to the slavery, the servanthood that we have here than the transatlantic slave trade. But of course, even in that context of that more servant-like bit, there's the potential for abuse, potential that people are not treated well, so there are rules to protect this group of people. Verse 20, anyone who beats their male or female slave with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a direct result. It doesn't matter if the person whose life you took was a slave or a servant, your life is still taken in return. I appreciate that the next verse probably catches your eye and feels particularly uncomfortable. But they are not to be punished, the owner that is not to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or two, since the slave is their property. Surprised if that didn't jar with you as Ed read it. And it seems to cut across something that David was saying last week about people never being property. Actually, the original reads, since the slave is their money. Funny phrase. And I think what's going on here is I think that the contrast is with verse 19. In verse 19, an injured person is compensated for the loss of their time. But since a slave, the work of a slave profits the owner, in that sense he is their money, economic benefit comes to them from the slave working for them, well, then if the slave is put out of action, no compensation is needed because it's the owner who misses out, because the slave is their money, their economic welfare depends upon that. I think that's the way it goes. It is kind of tricky, but don't miss the main point. In Israel, this very vulnerable group of slave servants were granted protection by this law, by all of these laws. So, look at verse 26 of chapter 21. An owner who hits a male or female slave in the eye and destroys it must let the slave go free to compensate for the eye. And an owner who knocks out the tooth of a male or female slave must let the slave go free to compensate for the tooth. In such a situation, the contract is over. All of the obligations that the servant slave had is finished at once. Providing in this kind of way for this group of people would have been utterly radical in the context of this time. And while we're thinking about the vulnerable, notice also the provision that is made for the unborn child. Verse 21 of chapter 21. If people are fighting and hit a pregnant woman, and she gives birth prematurely, but there's no serious injury, the offender must be fined whatever the woman's husband demands and the court allows. But if there is serious injury, you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. Now, there's some debate about the detail of this verse, but the very fact that there is a specific section dealing with pregnant women must be because there is a concern for the additional life that exists there. So it's the only reason you can make sense of plucking out this particular group of people and dealing with them separately. This unborn life needs protection and needs provision, is what these verses are saying. Okay. Enough about bulls, burglaries, and beatings. What about some contemporary application? How do we pull this into our current era? Well, a couple of very obvious applications. First, because every life matters and matters so much, and that's very clear from a passage like this, it has to inform our thinking about abortion and assisted dying. Now, I appreciate that both of those topics are emotive and complicated, and that's why a few years back we gave an evening to look at each of those in turn in an ethics series that we did. If you want to go to SoundCloud, search Christchurch Cambridge Ethics, you'll find that series. You could listen to those talks where we looked at those in detail, gave a whole evening over to each. But you can't miss that our starting point has to be the protection of life, and our starting point must be the protection of the unborn child. Couldn't be clearer. And then secondly, because the vulnerable are protected, we should have particular care, it seems to me, for the disabled, a vulnerable group amongst us. There's lots of noise recently about disability in the news because of that terrible incident at the zoo in Huntingdon, where a man with learning difficulties was responsible for a 3-year-old ending up in a crocodile enclosure. It's almost unbearably awful to imagine. But of course, as far as I can tell, at least in the public realm, nobody knows what actually happened. And I read a really thoughtful article this week about that incident, which speculated, wasn't saying this is what happened, but speculated, suppose that the man with learning difficulties noticed that the 3-year-old was struggling to see over the barrier. And suppose the man lifted the child up to gaze over the barrier, clearly an inappropriate thing to do to somebody else's child. But with his learning difficulties, he thought he was trying to be helpful. And suppose everyone around panicked and shouted and began running towards him. And suppose in his panic he let go of the child and fled. Would cast a very different gaze upon the incident, wouldn't it? And of course, I don't know if that happened. I have no idea what took place. What I do know is that there's been a torrent of online comments about people with learning difficulties, including some saying that this is precisely why such people should not be allowed to live. Unless we hold to the sanctity of life, unless we hold to a passion to care for the vulnerable, it will be much harder for us to resist such beliefs in our culture. Okay, so we've seen the sanctity of life. We've seen protection for the care of the vulnerable. Third theme, the principle of restitution. We've touched on this already. It's there in verse 23, life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand. And in a culture of excessive retribution like this that Lamech famously claims back in Genesis chapter 4, saying that he's going to kill a man for wounding him. This excessive retribution is limited and controlled by the principle of eye for eye, tooth for tooth, burn for burn, life for life, rather than allowing some sort of horrible spiral of ever-increasing retaliation. The punishment should be in proportion to the crime. And hence lots of the detail that we haven't got time to look at in chapter 23 about what should happen when someone sets fire to your crops or allows their animals to graze your land instead of their own, or borrows your ox and then carelessly loses it, or steals your sheep from you. In each situation, we see that the punishment that is set is appropriate for the kind of offence that was committed. That's a practical application of the eye for eye, tooth for tooth principle. But as we close, notice what Jesus does with this principle. You've heard that it was said, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to them the other cheek also. If anyone wants to sue you and take your shirt, hand over your coat as well. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. It is generosity gone wild, isn't it? I mean, it's extraordinary. what Jesus is pointing us to here. I mean, what kind of idea is this? How could this possibly work? And of course, the answer is that this idea is the gospel. And the gospel does work. Because in his passion, Jesus did turn the other cheek. And they hit that one too. In the passion, Jesus went the extra mile in self-sacrifice and more. Jesus gave away his clothes. And he did all of this while we were enemies. And he did all of it that he might give us life. The sacrifice of Jesus that's at the heart of the gospel, that informs and directs and energizes everything about the Christian faith, is so extravagant, so outrageous, that once you understand it, once you see what he has done for you, the heart of generosity that he has towards you, when you really understand it, you can't help but be changed by it. Because with Jesus, it's not an eye for an eye, is it? It's a saviour for a sinner. It's the Son of God given for you. And the reason that Jesus can make these outrageous claims to us and call us to set aside retribution and exhibit extravagant grace is because that's precisely what he's already done for us. So do you see that if you're struggling with a dispute in the workplace, if you're struggling with conflict in your marriage, if you're struggling because there are battles in your family, understand that grace really does work. Grace has the capacity to change people in the way that a tit for tat never will. Grace changes you and me. It changes the situations that we find ourselves in. And later on, when Hannah, Sam, and others are baptized, that's what we'll be seeing. We'll be seeing lives that have been changed by grace. Let me lead us in a prayer. Lord God, we thank you for Christ. We thank you for one who has extravagantly loved us. And as we see the way that he takes the laws of restitution and expands, deepens them, requires a completely different way of responding when we are wronged. And we know that there are complexities to that, and that justice still matters to you as well. But we see how grace changes us, changes our community, and through the work of your Spirit can change your world. Now help us to know this grace and live it. Amen.